podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, I want to thank everybody that listens to the show right off the top, of course, but I want to extend a special thank you, or maybe some promotion, for Bob Pace. It's his music that you hear opening and closing most of these shows. And then, of course, the introduction, that outstanding voice that you hear, is from John Schaefer. He's the Channel 5 sports director here in Des Moines, and he's kind enough to lend his voice, and I want to promote those guys. And since we're talking about promotion, I thought I would start this podcast with a little bit of self-promotion. People sometimes ask me, well, why do you do this? Or I think that what they're getting at is, how do you get off doing a podcast? Well, obviously I've got a background in broadcasting and radio, so it made it easy for me to pick this up and do it in my early retirement, having been at WHO. But also, self-promotion again. I think I'm right about a lot of stuff. I've got a pretty good track record on some of these things. And actually, a lot of the people from my generation do. The liberals, the hippies. I don't have any hair left, but you might almost be able to consider me an old hippie. And let me pick this up for you and go back to the early 70s. I was looking at the draft for the Vietnam War, and I was running around telling everybody, mostly out of self-preservation, that war's a mistake. We shouldn't be in that thing. I'm going to be drafted for a mistake. Well, fortunately, I didn't have to go, and time went on, and history has proven that indeed, to cite John Kerry, it was a mistake. Robert McNamara, one of the architects of the Vietnam War, the guy that had the domino theory going and was behind that with Kennedy and LBJ, came out with a book called The Fog of War, and he admitted as much. He said, I'm sorry, I was wrong. It was a mistake. My God, think of how many people died over that. Well, that's the Vietnam War in the 70s. Let's fast forward to the 80s. I'm at WHO, the alma mater of Ronald Reagan. He's president of the United States. We get kind of special access to him at WHO, I think, because he kind of has a kind feeling for WHO, and I'm doing police and fire reporting. I'm not the political guy, but I was around Reagan. I got to see him. He visited the station, and I was telling everybody that would listen to me, the guy's mashugada. The guy is getting on. I can see it. I can see that vacant stare in his eyes. He's got Alzheimer's, and everybody was, they disagreed with me. You just don't like him. You're a liberal. No, I'm telling you, there's something up. Well, later, as it turns out, there's been coverage, or there's been stories that he needed a little help getting from the helicopter to the White House by his wife. During the Iran-Contra hearings, he couldn't recognize some of his cabinet. Shortly after leaving office, he mistook books on his desk for trees. I saw this back in the 80s, folks, but, nobody was listening. I hope that they're listening now with the podcast. So fast forward again, the Iraq War. I'm telling everybody, the UN says that there are no weapons of mass destruction there, that Saddam got rid of them. The CIA spooks in our country are disagreeing. They're saying, nope, he still got them. We got to go to war. I'm standing on a street corner with about a dozen protesters and a sign protesting the Iraq War, trying to get the country or people to, rise up and stop it. But we went anyway, and it put as many, maybe 1 million Iraqi civilians in the ground, maybe 500,000. The totals vary. 7,000 U.S. boys and girls came home in boxes because of that war. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Again, I'm self-promoting a little bit, but I was right again. That Brady bill got withdrawn. And there was a huge run to the gun stores and the gun shows during the Obama administration. Every gun nut in the country was arming themselves with weapons of war, basically. And I was telling anybody that would listen, again, that ain't going to work. This is horrible. You can't have every gun nut, every crazy person in the country with access to these kinds of weapons. Because if you do, guess what's going to happen? Guess what did happen? Yeah, that's right. So, I'm tooting my own horn here a little bit, but I wanted to get to the other thing that we've talked about a lot on the podcast that I've been warning about or talking about, and it is climate change, or what's becoming known now as the climate crisis. And my perspective on this has been, it's bad, It's getting worse, and the reports that you're hearing and seeing in the news are conservative. The climate scientists have been telling us that every time they issue a report of some type. It could be worse than this. Okay, so long story short, we're getting to the reason for the podcast today. I'm looking through the pages of the Des Moines Register here, and I see an op-ed piece, and it's from Dr. Jerry Schnoor, and it's entitled, "We Must Act Quickly to Minimize Damage from the Climate Emergency." Now, the good doctor is the professor in civil and environmental engineering. He's a co-director for the Center of Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa, folks. So unlike just a podcaster popping off here, this guy's got the bona fides. I mean, he's legit, and he's on the podcast today, and he's joining us on the Podcast by George live line. Dr. Schnoor, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, George.
I just want to read a little bit of this. It was very informative and well written, and it reads very well too. So this is your writing. You say, "Is there a climate emergency? Most people recognize that we're having some really weird weather here in Iowa with severe flooding almost every year, punctuated by drought. Now, as our listeners know, this year the Missouri River flooded in Hamburg. It washed away $1.5 billion in dikes and levees. Temporary flood walls in Davenport and Burlington failed on the Mississippi River, causing extensive damage to downtown areas. Of late, we've had Category 5 hurricanes and major wildfires in California, the Amazon, South Asia, and Africa. As a matter of fact, 45 million are suffering drought, lack of rainfall, and failed crops in East and South Africa." So I don't want to read the entire thing. We'll get to some more of it later. But my take on this article was it's getting late, maybe later than we think. How alarmed are you, Dr. Schnoor? How bad is it right now, and how bad's it going to get?
Well, I think that's right. The forecasts, really we call them projections from models, have been exceeded by the impacts and the effects that we've seen so far. The ice seems to be melting somewhat faster, the sea level rising faster than earlier reports, and some of these impacts, as you mentioned, it might be wildfires in California. That's how they'll know climate change. In Iowa, we know it by severe precipitation events and flooding. In Miami, it might be blue sky flooding, and certainly recently in the Bahamas on Abaco Island, it's essentially unprecedented when a Category 5 storm stalls right over an island, and just horrendous, just a disaster. So because the events seem to have gotten worse, even than what the models previously projected, last year, October, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's more than 2,000 scientists who work on these international reports for us, they issued a sort of a wake-up call, and that is that our chance for action is slipping through our fingers if we don't act quite soon. And they said that in particular, we're going to warm at least another 0.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 0.8 degrees, 9.9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, or more, possibly 1.8 degree Fahrenheit warmer on a global average. Now, that may not sound like much, but when you think about the effects, the warmer seas, which spawn the hurricanes, the Category 4 and 5 hurricanes that we're talking about, the warmer seas, which evaporate more water into warmer air. Most of our weather here in Iowa comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and those seas are quite a bit warmer, and therefore we get these high clouds and intense precipitation events. So yeah, I'm concerned that the chance to mitigate climate change is slipping through our fingers, and we better do something now.
Well, here's what scares the bejabbers out of me, to go back to what I said earlier, the intergovernmental agency that you've spoken of. I've seen that referred to as conservative. Again, that it could be worse, and it could be much worse than what they're projecting. Do you view them as conservative?
I think that's right because these are consensus reports, and they have to get all 2,000 scientists to agree on what's in the report, and that's difficult to do because some of the things, particularly the models, I would say, are uncertain. So it's difficult to get everyone to agree, and what ends up being is a rather conservative report. For example, one of the big issues is what scientists call abrupt climate change. And that means that something could happen very fast, and that is difficult to predict because the probability of occurrence is almost zero. But the consequences, if that happens, are tremendous, are great, almost infinite. And when you multiply 0 times infinite, that's the risk that we have. We don't know how to do that. That's undefined. And therefore, they don't talk much about it. So if you're talking about the ice on Greenland slipping off much, much faster because of the meltwater lubricating the island ice interface, if that ice slips off, we could have, several feet of climate change in a relatively short period of time.
Several feet.
Those type of events they don't even talk about in the reports because it's too difficult to estimate the probability of it.
There's a lot of effects that can be seen and measured because of this climate crisis, but the sea level rise is one that is particularly alarming. I was reading a fellow, you may be familiar with him. He's considered one of the leading climate scientists, Richard Alley, and he said that I think his timeline was in the next 50 or 70 years. He said, again, that's kind of a worst case scenario from him, but he said the seas could rise 15 to 20 feet in the next 70 years. Now, that would be considered extreme by any measure, correct?
That would be abrupt climate change. That would mean that something drastic had happened in Greenland or the Antarctic. And while the probability of that is very low, like we talked about, George, it could happen. Now, the best estimate and what the reports talk about is 1 to 2 meters now. And that's greatly increased from just 10 years ago when we were talking about a maximum of 1 meter increase by 2100.
I've heard some scientists that say that the problem is so severe, the danger is so imminent, that our current technology and current measures, what we're even saying needs to be done, is going to have a problem getting the job. Well, here's what I'm getting at. Some people have said that we need to reinvest in nuclear energy to try to prevent this calamity. Do you buy into that?
Yeah, I think we have to look into nuclear energy. It would be more modular and much safer than anything we've had before. But the problem with that is the investment is so great, and the siting and the decisions that have to be made by government take so long that I don't see it as a solution for this next 10 years. The report that I talked about from IPCC, the wake-up call, is that we need a 45, they upped the amount, by the way, a 45% reduction in emissions of fossil fuels globally. We need that by 2030. That's just 10 years away. So in order to get even that into place, we're talking about building new solar panels, new solar power plants, new more wind energy, more battery efficiency, more electric vehicles that run on renewable power, a better smart grid. Our batteries in our cars would become a part of the storage for the grid. All of this takes time, and it needs to happen. Decisions need to be made now, investment decisions, in order to have that in place to achieve a 45% reduction, which is a big undertaking. Right now, we have never had a decrease in emissions. It's just gone steadily up with population, at the moment even faster than population. So first we have to level off our emissions and then decrease them very fast within the next 10 years by 45%.
Well, the fact that anybody, an old hippie like me particularly, would even be considering expanding nuclear energy is very interesting, because I've always been opposed to that because of the waste. What do we do? What happens with that nuclear waste? You store it. It's there forever. what happens in the future. But if you have to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea, maybe that's part of it. And, so talking about this nuclear energy thing gets me to thinking. This is interesting. I'm glad I got you on the live line here to talk about this because nuclear power. In your article, even, you cite the fact, and I hear this argument a lot, that we went to the moon. President Kennedy challenged the country, and we went to the moon. And that's evidence of the fact that we can solve this climate crisis. But I look at it a little differently. I look at another invention of modern time and think, maybe we can science our way out of this. Maybe we can invent our way out of this. And that is the atom bomb. I still look at that thing. I look at this nuclear bomb. How the hell did they ever figure that out? And it's so weird and so strange. If we can do that, and again, we're very good at making war and blowing people up, and that's kind of our forte, so that probably has something to do with but we were extremely motivated because of World War II. Our society was at risk. Everybody believed it and bought into it. The scientific community did, and they came up with that damn bomb, which is really weird stuff. Do you think, again, speaking as a scientist, can we invent, discover, science our way out of this like that bomb?
I don't consider, even though I'm an engineer, I don't consider myself a technological optimist. I think lots of things have to change, including our heart. Our hearts and our minds have to change about these kind of problems. For example, the most vulnerable and affected countries are really, it's an existential crisis for them. They're losing islands. They're having to move. People are dying. They don't know how they're going to feed their children, as I mentioned, in Ethiopia, for example, right now. So for those people, we need to act now. But regarding nuclear power, that may not be a part of our immediate response, but I think you have to look at it for the future. With my students, I talk about we talk about this, and I ask them, "Is nuclear power sustainable?" Well, no, it's not sustainable. We have to watch the wastes for 40,000 years.
Yeah.
That's longer than recorded history. Then I ask them, "Is it renewable?" Well, no, it's not renewable because we have to mine the uranium and get that from somewhere. So should we even be counting on it? And the answer is maybe, because this climate crisis is very, very serious, and it's now in the near term, the next 10 years.
And now I've got you on the line, this is another question, and I'm sure you've been asked that you can deal with, and I've been, whenever I bring up this climate change issue with people that are deniers or non-believers or don't want to do anything or just want to sit with their hat in their hands, they'll often say, well, people like Jerry Schnoor have been running around warning about the climate and the planet melting and climate warming since the 20s, since the 30s, since way back, and we're still going, we're still here, we'll survive this, everything will be fine. What do you tell people that say things like that?
Well, we won't. I ask them, when does it cost more not to act than to act? So I think we're beyond that point now. If you think about the damages just from the tropical cyclones, the hurricanes in recent years, including Maria in Puerto Rico and recently Dorian, if you just think of about that, and FEMA having to come to Congress, those storms have cost us about $300 billion in recent years, and it's unbudgeted. That has to be a new budget item each and every time. It's much cheaper now to act, renew our economy, create jobs and an economic engine. Right now in solar industry, we have 450,000 people employed, way more people in solar and wind than mining coal, only 75,000 coal miners left. So we're talking about really the way to power our economy in the future, and a necessary act that will hopefully save us from extinction of species, more and more sea level rise, more and more hurricane damage in Iowa, it's severe floods in California, it's wildfires.
My God, let's do something, folks. Let's take action, and I know that's what you're encouraging. Do you have a little checklist, as far as priorities are concerned, as to what needs to be done first, immediately, right now, or is it any and all of the above?
No, I actually do try to think about that. As a professor, we're supposed to profess something. If you can't act, you teach, and uh, that's where I'm at right now, George. But I think the number one thing, if I were king of the world, I would undergo massive reforestation. We have a lot of places that have become deforested, including part of Iowa, by the way. Some of those marginal lands should be replanted to trees which fix carbon into their woody biomass, or deep grasses which will put carbon into our soils. We call it regenerative agriculture. We need to not only plant forests, we need to put carbon back into our soils. And I would do that first because I think, A, it's rather inexpensive for the good that it does, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and mitigating those emissions. And B, it just makes sense to plant trees. Now, eventually those trees will climate. You'll have climax forests after, 50, 75, 100 years, and you'll have to cut them down and do something with it. I propose biochar. So I turn them into biochar, kind of a soil conditioner, put that back into the soil, and meanwhile replant the forest so they come back again. So I think that's the cheapest, smartest thing to do. But all the other things I mentioned we should be doing as well, because 45% reduction in just 10 years is a tall challenge.
Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for the advice and the insight, because as I explained to everybody, there's three things that I'm concerned about on the podcast, primarily that could get us all killed. And and the guns are part of it, as we talked about earlier. The fact that we're alienating these nuclear powers around the world that could send missiles in and kill us all that way. And of course, the longer term threat, which again may not be as long term as we think, the climate crisis. And joining us on the podcast by George.
It's no longer way out there. And that's why I'm considering nuclear power. Just a couple of years ago, I would have never advocated for thinking about nuclear power. But now, for the long term, we have to think about it, I think, because this climate crisis is very serious.
Well, let's call that the devil to save the deep blue sea. How's that?
Okay.
Nuclear power.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks again. That's Dr. Jerry Schnoor. He's professor in civil and environmental engineering, co-director of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa, and he's kind enough and good enough to join us today on the podcast by George Liveline. Thanks for listening, everybody, and continue to check us out on all the social media platforms. The podcast is growing. We're just a one-year birthday for the podcast. We're just over a year, and it's great to have the good doctor on the line. But for right now, that's going to have to do it. That's another podcast by George.